A frail old man sat alone in a rusted wheelchair in the center of a marble banking atrium, mud caked into the creases of his hands, his coat torn at the shoulder from years of where he never bothered to hide. He'd asked for nothing but a moment of someone's time. "Good morning, sir," the young man at the door had greeted him, polite enough on the surface. "Good morning, I need to see someone about my account," the old man answered. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but this is important." He'd smiled anyway. "Thank you." At the private banking counter, a woman looked up without warmth. "Good morning, sir, how can I help you? I want to process a withdrawal on this account. Sir, the line for withdrawals is over there. I have a certified check, that's why I came to this counter." "How much are you trying to withdraw?" he answered plainly. The number made her go still. "Sir, do you understand what you just said to me? I have an account here, please check it." She looked him over, the torn coat, the mud on his shoes, and decided in that instant exactly who he was. "With respect, sir, look at yourself. My clothes have nothing to do with my money. If someone told you to come in here and cause a scene, you can go back and tell them it isn't funny. I am not playing games with you, young lady. Please don't raise your voice at me. You're already drawing attention." That's when Senior Supervisor Alicia Campbell crossed the lobby, heels clicking sharp against the marble, her patience already gone before she'd heard a single true word of it. "What is happening at this counter?" "Ma'am, I'm sorry, it's this man. He's claiming he wants to withdraw a fortune and he won't leave." "Sir, is that true?" "Yes, I only asked her to check the account number on the check. This is not a shelter, this is a bank." "I understand this is a bank. That's exactly why I'm here. Every single week it's something. I have money in this bank. I have no patience left for this today. Leave or I will call security. I am not here to cause trouble. I only want what belongs to me. Are you telling me how to run my floor? No. Then why is your mouth still moving?" Alicia didn't wait for an answer. She reached behind the cleaning cart a janitor had left near the counter and lifted a heavy metal bucket, filthy with mop water, gray and sour and cold. And in front of 30 grown adults in tailored suits, in the middle of a lobby built to impress the wealthiest people in the city, she poured it over his head. The water ran down his gray hair, into the collar of his shirt, pooling dark and gritty at his feet. He didn't cry out. He didn't fight. He simply closed his eyes, the way a man does when he decided long ago that dignity is something you carry inside yourself because the world won't hand it to you. Around him, the lobby froze, phones half raised, mouths half open, nobody moving. That silence was the loudest thing in the room. Then it broke, not with a scream, but with the sharp, deliberate click of low heels crossing marble fast. "Have you lost your mind?" Nia Vance didn't ask permission to push through the crowd. She didn't wait for someone braver to go first, because in that moment there was nobody braver than her in that whole gleaming lobby. Still in her junior analyst blazer, badge swinging from her lanyard, she planted herself between Alicia and the old man like she'd been doing it her whole life. "Touch him again, Alicia," she said, voice shaking with something that wasn't fear, "and I'll make sure Human Resources isn't the only department calling you." Alicia blinked at her like she was seeing an insect crawl across her marble counter. "Excuse me, do you understand what position you're in right now, Nia?" "I understand exactly what position I'm in. I'm standing in the position of somebody with a conscience. You might want to try it sometime." A ripple went through the crowd, a few gasps, one nervous laugh quickly swallowed. Nobody had ever spoken to Alicia Campbell like that. But Nia had already turned her back on the supervisor, a small, deliberate insult in itself, and dropped to a crouch in front of the old man's wheelchair. "Sir, look at me." Her voice dropped low and soft, the way you'd talk to somebody's grandfather, because that's exactly what he was. "Hold still, sir. You deserve respect, no matter what clothes you wear. We're going to get you cleaned up, all right? I've got you." She grabbed a stack of clean towels from behind the reception desk without asking and began wiping the sludge from his face with a gentleness that made two tellers look away, blinking hard. "Somebody get me warm water. Now!" She didn't shout. She said it the way you say a thing when you already know it's going to be done, and it was. Alicia's voice cracked through the air behind them. "This is completely inappropriate. He came in here looking like a vagrant, and you're rewarding that behavior by babying him in front of clients." Nia didn't even turn around. "He didn't disrupt anything, Alicia. You did. You poured filthy water on an old man because his jacket wasn't nice enough for your lobby. That's not security. That's cruelty. And I hope somebody in this building has the stomach to say that to your face besides me. Here's the thing nobody in that lobby knew. Nobody understood why Alicia's hands had been shaking before she ever lifted that bucket. What fear was living underneath her crisp gray blazer, ugly enough to make her drown an old man in filth, rather than let him finish a sentence. Nia wheeled him into the staff break room, away from the whispers already spreading like smoke, and locked the door with her elbow, hands full of warm towels. "There we go," she murmured, wiping the mud from behind his ear. "You didn't deserve one drop of that, not one." His lip trembled, not from the cold anymore, but from something else, a man remembering he still mattered to somebody. "Thank you, my daughter," he whispered. "Thank you." She shrugged off her own coat, the kind a junior analyst saves 3 paychecks to buy, and wrapped it gently around his shoulders. While she turned to warm the water, his trembling fingers slid into his jacket and pulled out an old flip phone, so out of place in that glass building it looked like it belonged in a museum. His thumb found one worn button. "Do Hyana," he whispered. "Come quickly, but bring a flower for this brave young lady." On the 63rd floor of a tower in Seoul, a man in a charcoal suit went absolutely still. He hadn't said a word yet. He didn't need to. Because in the silence on the other end of that call, Yoo Do-hyun's blood had already gone cold, and the people in that boardroom with him would remember, for the rest of their lives, the exact moment his eyes changed. Somewhere, across an ocean, a woman named Alicia Campbell had no earthly idea what she'd just set in motion. If watching that woman drown an old man in filth made your stomach turn, if watching Nia stand up when a room full of grown adults stood frozen made you want to stand up too, hit that subscribe button right now. Do it for Sangmoon. Do it for every elder who's ever been looked past because of what they were wearing. And before Do-hyun's plane even touches down, if tonight made you feel something in your chest, I've got 2 full novels waiting for you that will wreck you and heal you in the same breath. It's all in the description and pinned comment below. Watching on your TV. Grab your phone, open the camera, and scan the gold code on your screen. That's all it takes to start the story waiting for you. The silence on the phone lasted exactly 4 seconds before Yoo Do-hyun's voice came out low and flat, more dangerous than any shout could have been. "Who touched you, father?" Around the long glass table on the 63rd floor, 6 men who had spent the last hour negotiating a fragile truce between 2 of Seoul's oldest syndicates watched their leader go from composed to something else entirely. Nobody at that table had ever seen it happen this fast. Do-hyun didn't raise his voice when he was truly angry. Everyone in that room had learned that lesson the hard way, at some point, in some room just like this one. The angrier he got, the quieter he became, until his voice was barely more than breath, and by then it was already too late for whoever had earned it. "Do-hyun, his father said, and even through the tremor still left in his voice, there was something else underneath it, something almost gentle. "I am all right. A kind young woman is helping me, but before her someone poured dirty water on me, in front of everyone." Do-hyun's jaw tightened. His eyes, dark and calculating under the fluorescent lights of the boardroom, went somewhere colder than any of the men across from him had ever seen. "Who?" he said again, softer this time, which was worse. "A woman, a supervisor. She did not know who I was. She only saw an old man in torn clothes and decided he did not belong." That was all it took. Do-hyun rose from the table without another word, buttoning his suit jacket in one smooth, practiced motion, the truce meeting forgotten as though it had never mattered. Because in that instant, it hadn't. The old man beside him at the table, a rival syndicate elder who had spent 30 years being feared in the city, opened his mouth to protest the interruption and then thought better of it. He had seen that look on Do-hyun's face exactly once before, and he still remembered what happened to the man who'd caused it. "We are not finished here," the elder said carefully. "We are," Do-hyun replied, already walking toward the door. "Someone put their hands on my father today. Everything else can wait." By the time the elevator doors opened onto the parking garage beneath the tower, 6 black SUVs sat idling in a tight formation, engines already running, drivers already in position, as though the entire convoy had been assembled and waiting for this exact moment his whole life had been quietly preparing for. That was the thing about Do Hyun's men. They didn't need to be told twice. One phone call from his assistant, 4 words relayed down the chain. Someone hurt his father, and the machine simply moved. He climbed into the back seat of the lead vehicle, and for a moment, before the door even shut, the man beside him, his second, a broad-shouldered enforcer named Reyes who had been with him since the beginning, since the years when they had nothing but each other and a debt to a lone shark that nearly buried them both, leaned in close. "Sir, what are your orders?" Do Hyun stared straight ahead at the concrete wall of the garage at nothing. "Find out who did this to him. I want a name before we reach the bank." "And if we already have one?" Do Hyun's eyes cut sideways, sharp as glass. "Then I want to know everything about her before I decide what I'm going to do to her." The convoy pulled out of the garage and onto the streets of Seoul like a single black organism, moving with a precision that made pedestrians stop on the sidewalk without knowing exactly why their instincts told them to step back. This was a man who had built an empire out of nothing but fear and discipline, who had learned as a boy. Watching his own father get pushed around by men who thought poverty made a person disposable, that the world only respected power. And now someone had put their hands, filthy, careless hands, on the one person in this world Do Hyun had sworn, since he was young enough to still believe in fairness, that he would protect with his life. His phone rang. He answered before the first ring finished. "Sir," came the voice of his lead analyst, a woman named Priya who had never once failed to have information ready the moment he needed it. "We've confirmed the supervisor's identity. Alicia Campbell, Senior Branch Supervisor, 11 years with the bank, clean record on paper." "On paper," Do Hyun repeated, his voice dropping another degree colder. "There are inconsistencies in some of her reporting we haven't been able to explain yet. I'll have more within the hour." "I don't care about her spreadsheets right now. I want to know who gave that woman permission to put her filthy hands near my father." The words came out low, deliberate, each one landing like a closed fist against the table. Reyes, beside him, said nothing, only watched the city blur past the tinted window and understood exactly how far this could go before the night was over. "There's something else, sir," Priya added carefully. "Witnesses say another employee intervened, a junior risk analyst. She's the one who got him cleaned up, wrapped him in her own coat. Staff are saying she stood up to Campbell in front of the entire lobby." For the first time since the phone call from his father, something in Do Hyun's expression shifted. Not softened exactly, not yet, but something in the hard line of his jaw eased, just slightly, the way stone eases under warm rain it hasn't decided yet whether to let in. "Find out who she is," he said quietly. "The woman in the navy jacket. She protected a king today, whether she understood that or not. I want her name before we arrive." Nobody in that car asked him what he meant by king. They already knew. His father had raised him from nothing, had worked himself down to the bone in a country that gave men like him no second chances, and had never once, in all those years of hardship, asked his son for anything except honesty and respect. Do Hyun had built an empire to make sure nobody would ever again look at his father the way that supervisor had looked at him this morning, and somebody had done it anyway. The convoy crossed the river, cutting through traffic that parted for them the way water parts for a blade, and Do Hyun leaned his head back against the leather seat and closed his eyes for just a moment, forcing his breathing to slow, forcing the fire in his chest to bank itself down to something he could control. This was the part of himself he hated most and needed most in equal measure. The part that could turn rage into precision, could take something this personal and still walk into a room with enough composure that his enemies would never see the blade until it was already at their throat. His phone buzzed again. A message from Priya this time, not a call. Analyst identified. Name, Nia Vance. Junior risk analyst, 18 months with the bank. No red flags. Colleagues describe her as principled. Some say difficult. One manager's note in her file calls her insubordinate, asks too many questions. Do Hyun read the words twice. Insubordinate. Asks too many questions. In his world, in the world he had built out of blood and discipline and the ashes of every man who had ever underestimated him, those two qualities were the rarest currency there was. Everyone around him nodded. Everyone around him agreed. Nobody, in 11 years of running an empire, had ever once stood between him and something he wanted and called it wrong to his face. But this woman had done exactly that for his father, a man she owed nothing to, a stranger in torn clothes who by every visible measure did not matter in a world built on appearances. She hadn't known who he was. She had simply decided he was worth protecting anyway. Do Hyun didn't know what to make of the tightness that settled in his chest at that thought, so he didn't try. He filed it away, the way he filed away everything that threatened to distract him, and turned his attention back to the only thing that mattered right now. "Priya," he said into the phone. "Lock down every financial system tied to that branch. Frozen. Nothing moves, nothing transfers, not one account opens or closes until I say otherwise. I want that building standing still by the time I walk through the door." "Understood, sir. Should I alert branch management?" "No." His voice went quiet again, that terrible quiet. "I want them to feel it happen before they understand why." The car slowed as it approached the final turn toward the bank, its glass tower rising ahead of them, gleaming and unaware of what was driving toward it. Do Hyun straightened his jacket, rolled his shoulders back, and let the last of the softness in his chest harden back into something useful. "One more thing," he said, almost to himself, but Reyes heard it anyway, and would repeat it later to the others in the convoy behind them, a warning passed down the line like scripture. "If a single drop of that water is still on him when I arrive, this building burns." Nobody in that car doubted for 1 second that he meant it. They pulled up outside the bank's main entrance just as the first black SUV's tires kissed the curb, and through the tinted glass, Do Hyun caught his first glimpse of the building where his father had been humiliated in front of strangers, and where, somewhere inside, a woman he had never met had done something no one in his entire organization had dared to do in over a decade. She had stood in front of a king and told the world he was worth protecting. He had no idea, stepping out of that car with fire still simmering behind his eyes, that he was about to walk into the one encounter that would change absolutely everything he thought he understood about power, about loyalty, and about what it actually meant to protect somebody he loved. If you felt that chill roll down your spine when he said this building burns, if part of you wanted to stand up and cheer because somebody was finally about to answer for what happened to Sang-moon, don't just sit with that feeling. Comment, burn it down, if you think Alicia Campbell has no idea what's about to walk through those doors. And stay with me, because Do Hyun is 2 minutes away from meeting the one woman in Seoul who isn't afraid of him at all. The glass doors of the bank didn't open so much as surrender. 6 men in dark suits moving through the lobby with the kind of quiet efficiency that made every hair on the back of a person's neck stand up before they even understood why. There was no shouting, no weapons drawn. Just men taking positions at every exit, at every stairwell, at the elevator bank, while terrified employees who had been going about an ordinary Tuesday morning found themselves suddenly unable to leave the building they worked in. A young teller reached for her phone, and a man in a black suit simply shook his head once, and she set it back down on the counter without a word. Nobody explained what was happening. Nobody needed to. The energy that had walked through those doors was the kind that didn't require an announcement. It simply arrived, and every person in that lobby understood, on some animal level, that the rules of their ordinary day had just been suspended. Alicia Campbell stood frozen behind the reception desk, her earlier fury replaced by something closer to dread, watching the men fan out through her lobby like water finding every crack in a dam. She didn't yet know why. She only knew, with the sick certainty of a woman who has spent years learning to read a room, that whatever was coming through that door next was going to be the worst thing that had happened to her in a very long time. And then he walked in. Yoo Do-hyun crossed the marble floor of the lobby, the way a storm crosses open water, unhurried, inevitable, impossible to look away from. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable, but there was something underneath the calm that made every single person in that lobby take an involuntary step back as he passed. He didn't look at Alicia. He didn't look at the frightened staff pressed against the walls, or the security guards standing useless and outnumbered near the entrance. His eyes moved across the room once, scanning, cataloging, before he asked a single question to no one in particular. "Where is my father?" A trembling teller pointed toward the staff break room down the hall, and Du Hyun walked toward it without another word, Ray's falling into step half a pace behind him, the rest of his men holding position in the lobby like a wall that had simply decided to grow out of the marble floor. He reached the break room door and stopped. Through the small window in the door, he could see them. His father, wrapped in a stranger's navy wool coat, sitting in his wheelchair with his head tilted slightly forward, while a young woman knelt beside him, running a wide-tooth comb gently through his damp gray hair, working out the last traces of mud with a patience that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with something Du Hyun didn't have a name for yet. She was murmuring something to him too low to hear through the glass, and his father was smiling, actually smiling, the way Du Hyun hadn't seen him smile in longer than he wanted to admit, nodding along to whatever she was saying like an old friend catching up over tea. Du Hyun's hand froze on the door handle. In 11 years of running an empire built on fear, of watching grown men flinch at the sound of his footsteps, nothing had ever stopped him mid-motion the way that image did. He had walked into that building ready to burn it to the ground floor by floor if a single hair on his father's head had been disrespected, and instead he found himself standing perfectly still in a hallway, unable to make his hand turn the handle, because whatever was happening on the other side of that glass felt too tender to interrupt. He pushed the door open anyway. Nia looked up first. She didn't flinch, didn't startle the way most people did when 6 armed men and a mob boss materialized in a doorway. She simply straightened her spine, kept one hand resting protectively on Sang-moon's shoulder, and looked Du Hyun directly in the eye like she had been expecting him, and was not particularly impressed by the weight. "Du Hyun, Sang-moon said warmly, reaching a hand toward his son. "You came." But Du Hyun barely heard him. He was still looking at her, at the fire in her expression, the set of her jaw, the way she hadn't moved an inch to make herself smaller in front of him the way everyone else in this building had. He had walked into rooms that made grown men across the underworld go pale. This woman looked at him like he was a mildly inconvenient weather pattern she'd deal with in a moment, once she'd finished what actually mattered to her. "Are you the one who cleaned my father?" he asked, his voice quieter than Ray's had ever heard it, stripped of the ice that usually lived there. "I am," Nia said, standing now, positioning herself slightly, almost unconsciously, between Du Hyun and the wheelchair, the same instinct that had put her between Sang-moon and a bucket of filthy water an hour earlier. "And before you say anything else, you should know I didn't do it because of who he turned out to be. I didn't know he had a son with 6 SUVs and an army in suits. I did it because a woman poured dirty water over an old man's head in front of 30 people who just stood there and watched. That's the only reason that matters to me." Something shifted behind Du Hyun's eyes, not quite a smile, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to both. Every single person who worked for him had spent years learning exactly how to speak to him, how much space to take up in a room he occupied, how far they could push before the temperature dropped and the conversation was over. This woman had known him for 11 seconds and hadn't adjusted a single thing about herself for his benefit. "I didn't do it for you or your suits," Nia added, when he still hadn't answered. "I did it because he's a human being, and where I come from, that's supposed to be enough of a reason. I didn't think I'd need a better one." Du Hyun studied her for a long moment, longer than was comfortable, longer than Ray's had ever seen him hold eye contact with anyone who wasn't either family or a threat. There was something in her posture, her voice, the sheer unwillingness in her to soften herself for a room full of danger, that pulled at a memory he hadn't let himself sit with in years. His father, decades ago, refusing to bow his head to loan sharks even when they had nothing left to lose, insisting that dignity was the one thing poverty could never actually take from a man unless he handed it over himself. Du Hyun had built an entire empire trying to make sure no one would ever test that theory on his father again. And here was a stranger who had defended that same principle without needing to be taught it, without needing a reason beyond the fact that it was true. "You have fire in your eyes, Miss Vance," he said finally, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there a moment ago, something quieter, something almost human. "I like that." "I don't need you to like it," Nia said, though something in her own expression had shifted too, some careful recalibration happening behind those sharp, steady eyes, like she was reassessing exactly who was standing in front of her and deciding she wasn't finished forming her opinion yet. "I need to know what happens now. Because your father has been through enough today, and I'd like to know whether you're here to help him or whether you're about to make things worse for everyone in this building, including people who had nothing to do with what happened to him." It was the kind of question no one in his organization would have dared ask him, not in that tone, not with that level of directness aimed straight at his chest. And for reasons he couldn't yet name, standing in a break room that smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic soap, watching this woman hold her ground in front of the most feared man in Seoul without so much as a tremor in her voice, Yoo Do-hyun found himself wanting, more than he wanted vengeance, more than he wanted Alicia Campbell's name on a list of people who would answer for this. He found himself wanting to know exactly who Nia Vance was, and how a woman who owed his family nothing had ended up being the only person in that entire lobby with the courage to do what was right. His father's hand found his sleeve, tugging gently, pulling his attention away for just a moment. "Do-hyun-ah," Sang-moon said softly, watching his son's face with the quiet, knowing patience of a man who had raised him from nothing and could still read him like an open book. "Before you decide anything about this building, I think there is something you should know about this young woman first." Do-hyun turned back toward Nia, and for the first time since he'd walked through those glass doors ready to burn the place down, the fire in his chest wasn't burning for revenge anymore. "There is something you should know about this young woman," Sang-moon said again. And Nia felt her cheeks warm under the weight of two sets of eyes now studying her instead of one. "Before I called you, before any of this happened this morning, I watched her argue with that same supervisor for 10 minutes about numbers that did not add up. I do not understand banking, Do-hyun-ah, but I understand people. And I understood that young woman was not fighting for herself in that argument." Nia's jaw tightened. She hadn't expected the old man to have noticed that, tucked away in the corner of the lobby before any of this exploded, waiting patiently for someone to help him while she argued in hushed, furious tones with Alicia about a discrepancy in quarterly reserve reporting that nobody else on the floor seemed willing to acknowledge existed. "It's nothing," Nia said quickly. "It's not important right now." "It is very important," Sang-moon said, gently but firmly, the way a father corrects a child he respects too much to let get away with false modesty. "Tell him." Do-hyun's attention sharpened, the softness from a moment ago folding itself back into something more focused, more dangerous in the way that intelligence is dangerous rather than the way violence is. "Tell me what, Miss Vance?" Nia hesitated only a second before deciding something inside herself, a decision Do-hyun would only understand the full weight of much later, once he learned exactly what she was risking by making it. She reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and pulled out a slim flash drive she'd been carrying for 3 weeks. Ever since the first night she couldn't sleep because a column of numbers in a quarterly report refused to make sense, no matter how many times she ran them. "I found irregularities in the offshore reserve accounts about a month ago," she said, turning the drive over once in her fingers before holding it out to him. "Small at first, the kind of thing you could explain away as rounding errors if you wanted to believe that badly enough. I didn't want to believe it. I kept digging anyway, because that's what I do, and the deeper I went, the worse it got. I brought it to my direct supervisor. She told me to drop it. Said I was young, said I didn't understand how complex international transfers work. Said if I kept pushing, I'd find myself looking for a new job in a market that doesn't forgive people who make senior staff look bad." "Who was your direct supervisor?" Do-hyun asked, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "Alicia Campbell." The name landed in the small break room like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading out in silence. Rays, standing near the door, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Sang-moon's hand tightened slightly on the arm of his wheelchair. She threatened me twice, Nia continued, her voice steady even as the memory clearly cost her something to say out loud. Told me if I took it further, if I went above her head, she'd make sure my performance reviews reflected someone who couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. I have 3 younger siblings I help support back home. I couldn't afford to lose this job over a hunch, even a hunch I was almost certain about. So I kept the files. I kept building the case quietly, on my own time, waiting for the moment I had enough proof that nobody could argue their way out of it. She looked directly at Do-hyun now, something unflinching and clear in her expression. I didn't know who you were an hour ago. I still don't fully understand what you are. But I know corruption when I see it, and I know a woman willing to pour dirty water on an old man's head is a woman capable of a lot worse when nobody's watching. So take it. I'd rather trust a stranger with power than keep protecting people who have already shown me exactly who they are. Do-hyun took the drive from her hand, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment longer than the exchange strictly required. And something passed between them that neither one of them had a name for yet. Not quite trust, not quite attraction, but the early architecture of both, built on the strange and immediate respect of 2 people who recognized, in each other, a refusal to look away from things that were easier left unseen. Priya, he said into his phone without breaking eye contact with Nia. I'm sending you a drive. I need everything on it cross-referenced against our banking division's compliance records within the hour. Copy that, sir. He pocketed the phone. Walk me through what you found. And that was when Nia Vance, junior risk analyst, a woman who had spent 18 months being told in a dozen small ways that her voice mattered less than her title, sat down at the break room table across from the most dangerous man in Seoul and began to talk numbers the way other women talked about their children. With precision, with pride, with a fierce protective instinct for the truth she had spent weeks assembling in the dark. The offshore accounts flagged under 3 shell entities all trace back to a single holding structure, she explained, pulling out a small notebook she'd apparently been carrying this whole time, pages dense with her own handwritten calculations. On paper, it looks like standard wealth management for high-net-worth clients, but the transfer timing doesn't match legitimate client activity. Money moves in and out in patterns that only make sense if you're laundering rather than managing. Deposits that spike right before quarterly audits, then quietly redistribute once the reporting window closes. I traced 11 months of it before I stopped counting because the pattern was already undeniable. Do-hyun studied the notebook she slid across the table, his eyes moving down the columns with the quick, absorbing focus of a man who had spent years reading financial documents that other people used to hide exactly the kind of thing she was describing. This isn't the work of someone hiding personal debt, he said slowly, almost to himself. This is structured. Someone taught her how to do this. That's what I thought too, Nia said, which means whatever she's involved in, it's bigger than her. Somewhere behind that thought sat the question neither one of them had an answer for yet. Who had taught a bank supervisor with a clean 11-year record how to build a laundering structure this sophisticated, and what did they want badly enough to risk everything for it? Nia had wondered about it late at night for weeks, turning the question over without finding an edge to grab onto. She wouldn't find the answer today, but the question would not stay buried for long. Do-hyun closed the notebook and looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes before it settled into open, genuine admiration. You've been looking at the wrong ledger, Mr. Yu, he murmured, almost like he was quoting her back to herself before she'd even said it, testing the shape of the words. Then, quieter, with the faintest trace of something almost like a smile. Look at what she hid here. You're not just beautiful, Nia. You're lethal with a spreadsheet. Nia raised an eyebrow, refusing to let the compliment land the way he clearly intended it to soften her. Save the compliments for after you've done something with what I just handed you. He stood, buttoning his jacket, the fire that had brought him storming through those glass doors an hour earlier now reshaped into something colder and far more precise. Then, let's go do something with it. They walked out of the break room together, Sang-moon watching them go with the quiet satisfaction of a man who suspected, long before either of the 2 young people in front of him did, exactly what was beginning to take root between them. In the lobby, Alicia Campbell was still standing near the reception desk, flanked now by two of Do-hyun's men, her earlier fury finally curdling into something closer to fear as she watched her boss. No, she was beginning to understand now. Her owner, the majority shareholder who had apparently been standing behind the curtain of this bank for longer than anyone on staff had realized, walked toward her with Nia Vance at his side, a notebook clutched in his hand like a verdict already written. "Mr. Yu," Alicia started, straightening her blazer, reaching for the composed authority that had carried her through 11 years of controlling every room she walked into. "I don't know what that girl has told you, but—" "Alicia," Do-hyun said, his voice quiet, almost gentle, the way a door closes softly right before it locks. "The woman you tried to fire for asking too many questions just handed me your arrest warrant." The color drained from Alicia's face, so fast it was almost audible. And for the first time since the bucket had left her hand that morning, she understood, with total and terrifying clarity, that the ground beneath her polished heels had already given way. She simply hadn't fallen yet. She didn't fall, not yet, not there in the lobby with two of Do-hyun's men flanking her like columns of stone. But Alicia Campbell's legs seemed to remember, on their own, exactly how close to collapse a person's body can get before pride is the only thing still holding them upright. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Do-hyun turned away from her without waiting for a response, because in his mind the matter was already settled, already handed off to people whose job it was to make sure justice moved through proper channels, instead of through the kind of violence his hands still remembered too easily. "Take her to my legal team," he said to the man on Alicia's left. "Nothing happens to her beyond that. Do you understand me? Nothing." The man nodded once and led Alicia away, her heels no longer clicking with the same sharp authority they'd carried all morning. And for the first time since Nia had met her, the woman looked small. Do-hyun turned back toward the break room, toward his father, toward Nia standing beside the wheelchair with her notebook still clutched against her chest like something precious she wasn't ready to let go of yet. Sang-moon was watching the two of them with a quiet, knowing patience that made Nia's cheeks warm again, though she couldn't have said exactly why. "Come," the old man said, gesturing them both closer with a hand that still trembled slightly from the morning's shock. "Before all of this happened, I came here for a reason. I think it is time I showed you both." He reached into the deep inside pocket of his torn coat, the same coat that had made a bank supervisor decide, in less than a second, that he wasn't worth her respect, and withdrew a small, weathered wooden box, its corners worn smooth by decades of handling, a brass latch tarnished dark with age. He held it in his lap like it weighed far more than its size suggested. "Do-hyun, do you remember why I came to this branch specifically, out of every bank in the city? You never asked me. You were too busy building your empire to ask an old man simple questions." Do-hyun's jaw tightened slightly, some old guilt surfacing that Nia recognized immediately, the particular ache of a son who loves his father fiercely but has let ambition steal the small, ordinary conversations that make up a life. "I assumed it was convenience, proximity to home." "No," Sang-moon said gently. "I came because this branch holds something I placed here 20 years ago, before your empire, before the money, before any of it. Something I have never told you about because I did not think it mattered to anyone but me anymore." His fingers worked the tarnished latch slowly, arthritis making the simple motion take longer than it should have, and neither Do-hyun nor Nia moved to help him, understanding somehow that this was a moment he needed to complete himself. The box opened with a soft creak, and inside, yellowed with age but carefully preserved in oilcloth, lay a stack of documents bound with faded string, deeds, old and official, stamped with seals from a district office that no longer existed under that name. 20 years ago, Sang-moon said, his voice growing distant with memory, there was a neighborhood on the edge of the city, poor, overlooked, the kind of place developers circle like vultures because the land is worth more empty than it is with families still living on it. A company tried to force everyone out, offered pennies for homes people had raised children in for generations, and when the families refused, they tried other methods, ugly methods, fires that were never explained. Water lines that mysteriously stopped working, Men who came at night to remind people how unsafe it could become to keep saying no. Nia felt something cold settle in her stomach, a memory stirring in a part of her mind she hadn't visited in years, half-formed, still blurry at the edges. "I was a young man then," Sang-moon continued. "Not wealthy, we had nothing, truly nothing. We were barely surviving ourselves. But I worked as a clerk in a legal office, and I saw the paperwork before anyone else did. I saw what they were planning to do, how they intended to falsify the original land records to claim the neighborhood had never been legally settled at all. So I did the only thing a poor man with no power could do. I copied the original deeds before they could be destroyed. I hid them. I moved them from place to place for years, terrified someone would find them, until I finally sealed them here, in this box, in this bank, under a private account no one but a lawyer I trusted knew existed." He looked up, his eyes glassy now, fixed on Nia with an intensity that made her breath catch in her chest. "The neighborhood was called Willowbrook Row." Nia went very still. "My daughter," she whispered, the word slipping out before she'd decided to use it. "Did you say Willowbrook Row?" "I did." Her hands began to shake, the notebook nearly slipping from her grip before she caught it against her chest. "That's where I grew up. That's where my grandmother's house still stands, the only house on that street that wasn't torn down when everything around it went up for redevelopment. My whole life, my family talked about it like a miracle, how the land somehow got protected right when it looked like we were about to lose everything, how nobody ever fully understood who filed the paperwork that saved us, only that it happened right before the deadline, right before we would have been forced out with nothing." Her eyes filled, and she didn't try to stop it. "My grandmother used to say God sent an angel to save that street. She never knew a name. She just knew somebody, somewhere, had cared enough to fight for people the rest of the city had already given up on." Sang-moon reached for her hand, his weathered fingers closing around hers with surprising strength. "I was no angel, my daughter. I was simply a man who could not stand by and watch power crush people who had done nothing to deserve it. I filed the true deeds anonymously the week before the deadline. I never told anyone. Not even my son knew the whole story." Do-hyun stood frozen beside them, watching this unfold with an expression Nia had never seen on him before. Not the cold calculation from the car, not even the quiet tenderness from the break room, but something rawer, something that looked almost like a man watching the ground beneath his entire understanding of his own family rearrange itself in real time. "Your father didn't just save money here," Nia said softly, looking up at Do-hyun through eyes bright with unshed tears. "He saved my childhood home. He saved the street where I learned to ride a bicycle, where my grandmother taught me to cook, where I fell asleep every night as a little girl feeling safe because I didn't know how close we'd come to losing everything." Her voice cracked. "Our families were tied together long before today, weren't they?" "It appears so," Do-hyun said quietly, and there was wonder in his voice now, genuine and unguarded, a rare crack in the composure he had spent a lifetime perfecting. He knelt beside his father's wheelchair, taking the old man's other hand, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of 2 decades folding quietly into the small space between them. Here was the question that would sit with Nia long after she left that break room, one she wouldn't find the full answer to for some time yet. If her family's survival had been tied to this man's father for 20 years without either of them knowing it, what else about their 2 lives had already been quietly intersecting in the dark, waiting for a morning like this one to finally bring it into the light? "All these years," Sang-moon said, patting his son's hand, "I told you that true strength does not always announce itself. I told you power means nothing if it is not used to protect people who cannot protect themselves. I did not think you were listening. But perhaps," he said, glancing at Nia with something like quiet delight, "the lesson finally found its way to you through someone else." Do-hyun looked up at Nia, and whatever had been building between them since the moment he first saw her kneeling beside his father in that break room. Respect, admiration, the electric pull of 2 people who recognized something rare in each other, deepened now into something neither of them had a word for yet, something rooted not in attraction alone, but in 20 years of invisible thread finally pulled taut between 2 families who had no idea, until this very moment, how much they already owed each other. "Now you see the heart behind the blood, Miss Vance," Do-hyun said quietly, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. Nia could only nod, pressing the old man's hand between both of hers. Understanding for the first time that the fierce, guarded loyalty simmering just beneath this family's danger had been protecting people like her. People who would never even know their name, for far longer than she'd ever imagined. If that revelation gave you chills, if watching Do-hyun kneel beside his father and finally see him as more than a mob boss made your chest tighten, hit that like button right now. Because Sang-moon's quiet courage 20 years ago is about to change everything for the people standing in that room today. And if a story about hidden kindness finding its way home is exactly the kind of story that stays with you long after the screen goes dark, I want you to have something else tonight, too. I've put together 2 full novels that will hold your heart the same way this one has one that will break it wide open, and one that will gently put it back together. They're waiting for you in the description and the pinned comment below, one simple click away. If you're watching on your TV right now, just lift your phone, open the camera, and scan the gold code on your screen. Let tonight's story lead you straight into your next one. By the time Nia finished helping settle Sang-moon into a car bound for one of Do-hyun's private residences, the sun had already begun sinking behind the city skyline, and she found herself standing in the emptying lobby wondering how an ordinary Tuesday had turned into the strangest, most emotionally exhausting day of her life. "You look like a woman who hasn't eaten since breakfast," Do-hyun said, appearing beside her with his jacket buttoned once again, the chaos of the afternoon folded neatly back beneath his composure the way it always seemed to be. "I haven't," Nia admitted, surprised into honesty. "Then let me fix that. It's the least I can do, considering what you handed me today." He said it simply, without the weight of an ulterior motive, though something in his eyes suggested the invitation meant more to him than he was letting on. "My team will be here through the night going through the accounts. There's nothing more for either of us to do here until morning." She should have said no. Every instinct built over 18 months of watching how quickly power in that building could turn against the people who didn't have enough of it told her to go home, lock her door, and process the day alone the way she processed everything. Quietly, on her own terms, without letting anyone close enough to see the parts of her that still ached. But something about the way Sang-moon had looked at her in that break room, something about the strange, invisible thread now tying her family's survival to this man's for 20 years, made the usual caution feel almost beside the point. "All right," she said, "but I'm not getting into one of those SUVs looking like I've been mopping floors all day." Do-hyun almost smiled. "Almost. There's a car waiting whenever you're ready." The restaurant he took her to occupied the top floor of a building overlooking the river. A private room with a single table set for 2, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city lights like a painting nobody, but them had been invited to see. It was the kind of place Nia had read about in magazines and never once imagined stepping foot inside. And for a moment, seated across from a man whose name apparently controlled a significant portion of the bank she worked for, she felt the old, familiar instinct to make herself smaller, to apologize for taking up space in a room built for people who belonged in rooms like this. She caught herself doing it and stopped. "You keep doing that," Do-hyun observed, pouring wine into her glass without asking, the kind of small, attentive gesture that felt at odds with everything she'd assumed about a man who commanded armed convoys through city streets. "Doing what?" "Shrinking, every time the room reminds you that you don't think you're supposed to be here." He set the bottle down. "You didn't shrink in that lobby this morning. You didn't shrink in front of me, or Alicia, or 6 armed men who could have made your life very difficult if I'd been a different kind of person. I'd like to know why a restaurant does what none of that could." Nia turned her glass slowly by the stem, considering how honest she wanted to be with a man she'd known for less than 12 hours. "Because in that lobby, I was defending something I believed in. In here, I'm just a woman who grew up watching her mother count coins at the kitchen table to figure out if we could afford both groceries and the electric bill that month. Rooms like this were never built with people like me in mind, Mr. Yu. I don't resent that. I just don't forget it either." Something in Do-hyun's expression shifted, quiet and unguarded, and for the first time since she'd met him, Nia watched the mask of controlled power slip just far enough to reveal the man underneath it. "Neither do I," he said. "Forget it, I mean." He looked out the window at the city below, lights stretching endlessly toward the horizon. "I grew up in a one-room apartment with my father in a neighborhood the developers hadn't gotten to yet. We didn't have heat some winters. I used to watch loan sharks come to our door demanding money my father didn't have, watch him bow his head and apologize for a debt that was never really his to begin with, just to keep them from putting their hands on me. I was 12 years old the first time I understood that respect in this world isn't given to good people. It's given to powerful people. And I decided, standing in that doorway watching my father beg men who didn't deserve his dignity, that I would rather be feared than ever watch that happen again." Nia set her glass down carefully, something in her chest tightening at the rawness in his voice, a vulnerability she suspected very few people had ever been allowed to witness. "That's the boy talking," she said gently. "The one who was scared and couldn't protect his father. But you're not 12 anymore, Do-hyun. You have more power now than you know what to do with. A man with your resources, your reach, your intelligence, you could build hospitals, schools. You could rebuild entire neighborhoods the way your father quietly saved mine, except you could do it in the open, with your name on it, and never once need a bucket of fear to make it happen." She leaned forward slightly. "Why choose fear when you could choose almost anything else?" Do-hyun was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. "Because fear kept my father alive when we had nothing," he said finally, quietly. "Fear is the only currency that never failed us. Kindness didn't stop the loan sharks. Hope didn't stop the men who came to threaten an old woman 2 doors down from us until she signed over her home for pennies. Fear did. Fear built walls around the people I love that nothing else in this world was strong enough to build. I know it isn't beautiful. I know it isn't what a woman like you wants to hear across a dinner table. But it is the truth, and I have never had the luxury of choosing comfortable truths over useful ones." "I understand why you believe that," Nia said, her voice soft but unwavering, the same steadiness that had carried her across a marble lobby that morning without a single tremor. "I understand where it comes from, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend your father's suffering wasn't real, or that the world was ever fair to either of you. But fear is a wall, Do-hyun. Walls keep danger out, but they also keep everyone else out too. You've built an empire so strong nobody can touch your father again, and in the process, how many people have you kept at arm's length who might have actually loved you the way he does? How many rooms have you walked into today where people were terrified of you instead of grateful to know you?" She reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but close enough that the gesture carried its own quiet weight. "Let me show you a better way to protect what you love, not instead of your strength, alongside it. Fear got your father through the winters when you had nothing, but you have everything now. Maybe it's time to ask what a different kind of protection could build." Do-hyun looked at her outstretched hand for a long moment, something warring behind his eyes, decades of hardened instinct pulling against something newer, more fragile, awakened somewhere in that break room hours earlier and growing steadily larger ever since. "You ask questions no one in my life has ever dared to ask me," he said quietly. "Somebody should have asked them a long time ago." "Perhaps," he admitted, and for the first time all evening, something like genuine warmth broke across his features, unguarded and real. "Or perhaps I simply needed the right person to ask them." Outside, the city glittered on. Indifferent to the quiet unraveling happening at that private table, a man built entirely out of armor discovering, for the first time in longer than he could remember, what it felt like to sit across from someone who wasn't afraid of him and wasn't trying to use him either, someone who saw exactly what fear had cost him and refused to look away from it out of politeness. Nia didn't know it yet, but somewhere across the city, in an audit file being quietly compiled overnight by Do-hyun's most trusted analyst, a second name had just surfaced beside Alicia Campbell's, one connected to a criminal network far more dangerous than a single corrupt bank supervisor, one that was about to make tonight's dinner feel like the last quiet moment either of them would get for a very long time. Do-hyun's phone rang at 11 that night, just as their driver pulled up outside Nia's apartment building, and the name on the screen, Priya, calling instead of texting, which she never did unless something was wrong, made his entire body go still before he'd even answered. "Talk to me," he said. "Sir, I finished cross-referencing the shell accounts against our organized crime database." Priya's voice was clipped, urgent, the sound of a woman who had found something that scared her. Alicia Campbell wasn't laundering money for herself. She was moving funds for the Silver Snake Gang, Han Jaiwoo's people. And sir, the volume, the timing, the destination accounts, this wasn't just cleanup work. She was helping them stage a war chest, a large one. Positioned to move the moment they had a reason to strike. Do Hyun's jaw tightened, every soft edge that dinner had worn into him over the last 2 hours hardening back into something sharper. Han Jaiwoo has been quiet for 3 years. He's not quiet anymore. Sir, our systems flagged unusual activity at the branch 15 minutes ago. Server access attempts, physical security breaches on 2 entry points. I think they know we found them. I think they're moving to destroy the evidence before we can act on it. Where's Nia? The question came out faster and rougher than he intended, and beside him in the back seat, Nia, who had only caught half the conversation but understood exactly enough of it to feel her stomach drop, sat up straighter. "She left the building 2 hours ago with you, sir, but her personal files are still in the system, tied to the audit trail. If they're trying to erase evidence, anyone connected to that paper trail becomes a loose end they'll want handled." Priya's voice tightened further. "Sir, some of the men flagged on our building's security feed match known Silver Snake enforcers. They're already inside the lobby." "We're 2 minutes out," Do Hyun said, and the driver, without needing to be told twice, put the car into a hard turn and accelerated back toward the bank. "What's happening?" Nia asked, her voice steady even as her pulse had clearly picked up, watching the careful, controlled man beside her transform in real time into something colder, more focused, every muscle in his body coiling toward a single purpose. "The people Alicia was laundering money for know we've exposed them," Do Hyun said, checking something inside his jacket that Nia realized, with a jolt, was a weapon. "They're trying to destroy the evidence before we can use it, and you're on that evidence trail. Then send me somewhere safe. Don't." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended, and he caught himself, softening it only slightly. "Whatever is waiting in that building, I need you where I can see you. I am not leaving you unprotected while men who launder blood money for a living are loose in a lobby you were standing in 8 hours ago." The car screeched to a stop outside the bank, and Do Hyun was out the door before it had fully stopped moving, Nia close behind him despite every instinct in her screaming at her to run the other direction. The lobby that had been gleaming and orderly that morning was in chaos, overturned furniture, shattered glass from a side entrance. 3 of Do Hyun's night security team already down near the elevator bank, and 4 men in dark clothing moving with brutal efficiency toward the server room where the audit files were being compiled. "Get behind me," Do Hyun said, his voice low and lethal, positioning his body between Nia and the men now turning toward the sound of the door. "No one touches you while I breathe." One of the enforcers spotted them and raised a weapon, and everything that happened next unfolded faster than Nia's mind could fully process. Do Hyun moving with a speed and precision that made it obvious, in a single devastating instant, exactly how a boy who grew up watching lone sharks threaten his father had learned, over the following 20 years, to make absolutely certain no one would ever be able to threaten what he loved again. He closed the distance to the first man before the weapon could level, disarming him with a brutal economy of motion, using the man's own momentum to send him crashing into the marble reception desk. Ray's and 2 more of Do Hyun's men poured through the door behind them, engaging the remaining enforcers, the lobby erupting into controlled violence that Nia had never witnessed up close in her life. She pressed herself against the wall exactly where Do Hyun had positioned her, heart hammering, watching a man she had shared wine and vulnerability with 2 hours earlier move through combat with a focus that stripped away every ounce of civility he'd shown her at dinner, revealing instead the version of himself that had built and defended an empire out of nothing but sheer, unbending will. It should have frightened her. Some part of it did. But watching him fight, not for territory, not for pride, but specifically, deliberately, to keep every one of those men as far from her as physically possible. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was not the violence Alicia had accused him of representing. This was something closer to devotion, terrible and raw, but devotion all the same. "They came for the files," Du-hyun said through gritted teeth, driving his elbow into the ribs of the man who tried to circle behind him. "But they won't leave this lobby alive." One of the enforcers broke away from the fighting and lunged toward Nia instead, clearly recognizing her, clearly having been given instructions about exactly who else needed to be silenced tonight. And for one suspended, terrifying second, Nia realized she was the actual target, not simply collateral standing too close to the real fight. Du-hyun saw it a half-second before it happened. He crossed the space between them faster than should have been possible, throwing himself between Nia and the enforcer's blade just as it came down, taking the cut across his forearm instead of letting it find her. The impact spinning him but not stopping him, his free hand already closing around the man's wrist and wrenching the weapon away with a violence that ended the confrontation almost as quickly as it began. "Du-hyun," Nia's voice cracked as she saw the blood soaking through his sleeve, dark and immediate, and every ounce of composure she'd carried through this entire impossible day threatened to crack right along with it. "I'm fine," he said, though his jaw was tight with pain he was refusing to acknowledge, standing his ground between her and the last of the fighting until Reyes and the others finished subduing the remaining enforcers, zip-tying them against the very marble counter where Alicia had poured filth over an old man's head that same morning. The lobby fell into a ragged, breathing silence, broken glass, and overturned chairs scattered across the floor that had gleamed so pristinely just hours before. Nia moved toward Du-hyun immediately, her hands finding the wound on his forearm without hesitation, pressing her own scarf against it to slow the bleeding, the same instinct that had made her kneel in front of a stranger in a wheelchair that morning now directing every movement of her hands. "You fought like a monster," she said, her voice trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, tears gathering in her eyes as she worked. "But you bled to keep me safe." "I would do it again," Du-hyun said quietly, watching her hands work with an intensity that had nothing to do with the pain in his arm. "I would do it 100 times, Nia, and never once regret the cost." Somewhere behind them, one of the restrained enforcers began to laugh, a low, unsettling sound that cut through the tense silence of the lobby like a blade of its own. "You think this was the plan?" he rasped, blood on his lip, eyes glinting with something that made every hair on Nia's arms stand up. "Tonight was never the real attack, you Du-hyun. It was only the warning. Han Jae-woo doesn't waste his best men on a bank lobby. You'll understand what we actually came for soon enough, and by then, it will already be too late to stop it." Du-hyun's expression went very still, the warmth that had briefly softened him in that private restaurant disappearing entirely, replaced by something cold and calculating as he crouched in front of the bound man, his voice dropping to a register that made even Reyes take an unconscious step back. "Then you'd better hope," Du-hyun said quietly, "that whatever you're planning happens before I find you again, because next time I won't be nearly this patient." But even as he said it, some small, cold part of him was already turning over the man's words, searching for what he might be missing. What larger plan tonight's failed ambush had only been the opening move for, and whether the woman standing beside him, blood-stained scarf still pressed against his arm, had already become far more central to Han Jae-woo's true target than either of them yet understood. If your heart is still pounding the way mine is, if watching Du-hyun throw himself between Nia and that blade made you catch your breath, don't scroll away from this now. Subscribe to follow the romance and justice of the Biko Empire, because tonight's ambush was only a warning, and Nia Vance just became a target in a war she never asked to be part of. The answer came within the hour, when Priya's voice crackled through Du-hyun's phone again, shakier this time than Nia had heard it all night. "Sir, we pulled the full history on the accounts Alicia was managing. This wasn't a one-time laundering job. She's been feeding Han Jae-woo information for over a year, building profiles, mapping vulnerabilities, identifying exactly which people in your world mattered most to you. Sir, she's the one who told them about your father's routine, the bank he visits." The days he comes alone. A pause, heavy with dread. She's the reason they knew exactly where to find him this morning. Something in Do Hyun went very quiet, quieter than the rage from that morning, quieter than the cold precision of the fight in the lobby. This was a different kind of stillness. The stillness of a man watching every fragile, careful thing he loved get reduced, in his mind, to a target painted on a map by a woman he had let walk out of that lobby breathing. "Where is she?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Legal team has her in the executive conference room on the 4th floor, sir, processing paperwork for the federal handoff." He was already moving before Priya finished the sentence, and Nia, still holding the blood-soaked scarf she'd used on his arm, felt the temperature of the night shift around her like a door opening onto a storm. "Do Hyun." She caught his sleeve, the good one, and he stopped for a fraction of a second, long enough to look at her, and what she saw in his face frightened her more than anything that had happened in that lobby 15 minutes earlier, because the fighting had been controlled, precise, purposeful. What she was looking at now was something else entirely. The 12-year-old boy who had watched his father bow his head to men who didn't deserve it, finally standing in a room with the power to make sure it never happened to anyone he loved again, and no longer certain he wanted to use that power carefully. "Stay here," he said. "Raze will stay with you. Do Hyun, whatever you're about to do." "I have to go," he said, and then he was gone, taking the stairs 2 at a time instead of waiting for the elevator, Nia's protests trailing behind him unheard. She didn't stay. Of course she didn't stay. She had spent her entire life being told to wait quietly while other people decided things that mattered to her, and she had learned a long time ago exactly what silence cost the people who chose it. She pushed past Raze's half-hearted attempt to stop her. He clearly understood, better than his boss did in that moment, exactly who Nia Vance was and how little use there was in trying to contain her, and ran for the stairwell. By the time she reached the 4th floor, the conference room door stood half open, and through the gap she could see Do Hyun standing over Alicia Campbell, who had gone perfectly, terribly still in her chair. 2 members of the legal team frozen against the far wall, and a weapon in Do Hyun's hand, leveled and steady, pointed directly at the woman who had, in a single day, drowned his father in filth and set an ambush that had put a blade against Nia's own throat. "You put my father in mud," Do Hyun said, his voice low, shaking with a fury Nia had never heard from him, not even in the lobby, not even fighting for her life 15 minutes earlier, "and my woman in crossfire." "Do Hyun, please," Alicia said, her carefully composed authority completely gone now, replaced by raw, animal fear. "I didn't know what he'd do with the information. He said he only wanted to understand your schedule, your patterns. I owed him money, I had no choice. You don't understand what he threatened to." "I don't care what he threatened you with." Do Hyun's hand didn't waver. "You had a choice every single day for a year. You chose to sell my father's safety to a man who tried to murder the woman I—" He stopped himself, jaw clenched, the sentence unfinished, but its shape unmistakable to everyone in that room. Nia's breath caught in her chest. She pushed the door open the rest of the way and stepped inside, and the sound of it made Do Hyun's eyes flick toward her for half a second, just long enough for her to see the war happening behind them. The man who had held her scarf-wrapped arm gently that same night, and the boy who had decided, 20 years ago in a cold apartment, that fear was the only currency strong enough to keep the people he loved alive. "Do Hyun, stop," Nia said, and her voice, though shaking, carried across that room with the same unwavering clarity it had carried across the marble lobby that morning. "Look at me, not her." He didn't lower the weapon. His hand was trembling now, the first tremor Nia had seen in him since she'd met him, the fury and the grief and 20 years of buried terror finally converging into a single unbearable pressure behind his eyes. "She would have let them kill him," Do Hyun said, and his voice cracked on the last word, the composed empire builder splitting open to reveal the boy underneath, still watching lone Shark's threaten a father he couldn't protect. "She would have let them take you too, Nia. Do you understand that? I finally found someone worth building a different life for, and she was willing to hand that to a man who would have ended it without a second thought." "I understand," Nia said softly, taking one careful step closer, then another, until she was standing beside him rather than across from him, her hand coming to rest gently on his forearm, the same arm still bleeding beneath the scarf she'd tied there an hour ago. I understand exactly what she almost cost you. I felt that blade tonight too, Do-hyun. I know what it feels like to almost lose everything in a single second. But if you pull that trigger right now, in this room, in cold blood with witnesses standing against that wall, you don't become the man who protected his father today. You become the monster she thought your father was this morning. The monster this whole city already whispers about behind your back. And once you cross that line, there's no walking back across it. Not for you. Not for us. Not for the empire your father is trying to help you build into something better than fear. Do-hyun's hand didn't move, the weapon still leveled, his breathing ragged, every part of him straining against 20 years of instinct that told him this was exactly how you protected the people you loved. You made certain, absolutely certain, that anyone who threatened them paid a price severe enough that no one would ever try again. She has to answer for what she did, he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. She will, Nia said. In a courtroom, in front of every federal investigator your legal team can put in that room, in a way that exposes exactly what she did, and exactly who she did it for, in a way that protects your father's story and mine instead of burying it under one more body the tabloids can twist into proof that you're everything the world already fears you are. She tightened her grip on his arm. Let me show you the better way, Do-hyun. Right now. Not tomorrow. Not after you've already done something you can't undo. Right now. The room held its breath. Alicia sat frozen in her chair, tears streaking silently down her face, understanding with total clarity that her life was balanced on the edge of a decision being made by two other people entirely. The man deciding whether 20 years of hard-won discipline could hold against a single night of unbearable fear, and the woman standing beside him. Refusing to let go of his arm, refusing to let him become something he would never be able to forgive himself for. Do-hyun's finger remained on the trigger. And then, slowly, with a tremor that ran through his entire body like something breaking and mending all at once, his hand began, just barely, just slightly, to lower. If you were holding your breath just now the way I was, if some part of you wanted him to pull that trigger, and another part of you was praying he wouldn't, drop a comment below and tell me honestly. Would you have stood up to Alicia the way Nia did this morning, even knowing everything it might cost you? Because in about 30 seconds, we're going to find out whether Do-hyun's answer to that same question saves him or destroys everything he's built. The weapon had barely dropped an inch when it stopped again, hovering, Do-hyun's hand caught in the space between the man he had been for 20 years and the man Nia was asking him to become. And in that suspended, agonizing moment, the door behind them opened once more. Sang-moon rolled his wheelchair into the room himself, having refused, apparently, to let anyone carry him up those stairs when his son's whole future was balanced on a trigger 4 floors above where he'd been resting. He must have heard the commotion, must have understood, with the instinct only a father carries, exactly what kind of danger his son was standing inside of. Do-hyun, Sang-moon said, and his voice, though weathered and quiet, filled the room the way nothing else in it had managed to. Look at me. Do-hyun didn't move, his eyes still fixed on Alicia, the weapon still raised, his whole body a coiled wire vibrating with 20 years of grief he had never once let himself fully feel. I said, look at me, son. Something in the old man's tone, not a request now, but the full, unmistakable weight of a father's command, finally broke through. Do-hyun's eyes flicked toward him, and what he saw there stripped away another layer of the armor he'd built around himself since he was 12 years old. His father, still in the wool coat a stranger had wrapped him in that morning, sat in that wheelchair with tears standing in his eyes, not from fear, not from the violence in the room, but from something far more painful. The sight of his son standing on the exact edge his father had spent a lifetime trying to keep him from ever reaching. Lower the gun, son, Sang-moon said softly. Listen to the girl who wiped the mud from my face. She has more wisdom in her than either of us has earned in all our years. Nia's hand tightened around Do-hyun's forearm, and she stepped fully in front of him now, placing herself directly between the weapon and Alicia, her body trembling but her voice steady. steadier than it had any right to be given everything the day had already asked of her. "Choose justice for us, Do-hyun," she said, looking up into his eyes, refusing to let him look away from her the way he'd been looking away from everything except his rage. "Not blood, please choose us." "Nia, move." His voice cracked on her name, torn between the desperate need to protect her and the equally desperate fear of what he might do if she stayed exactly where she was standing. "Oh," she said, "I'm not moving. If you want to pull that trigger, you're going to have to look at me while you do it, because I am not going to let you carry this alone in some dark room afterward, telling yourself it was the only choice you had. It wasn't. It isn't." Her eyes filled, finally, the composure that had carried her through this entire impossible day beginning to crack under the weight of everything she was asking him to release. "Her life isn't worth losing what we're building together. Do you hear me? Whatever this is between us, and I think you know it's already something, I think you've known it since that break room this morning, it cannot survive what you're about to do. I cannot love a man who chooses this. I want to. God help me, some part of me already does, but not if this is who you decide to be tonight." The word love landed in that room like something physical, and Do-hyun's whole body went still in a different way now, the fury draining out of him not through force, but through something gentler. Something that had been quietly building since the moment he first saw her kneeling in front of his father with a towel in her hands, asking nothing for herself, expecting nothing in return. His arm began to shake harder, and slowly, finally, he lowered the weapon the rest of the way, letting it fall to his side, his shoulders dropping as though an enormous weight he'd been carrying since he was 12 years old had finally, for the first time, been set down. Nia didn't wait to see if the moment would hold. She turned, pulled her phone from her pocket with hands that were still shaking, and made the call she had been planning since the moment she stepped into that stairwell Federal Financial Crimes Division. A contact she'd quietly built a relationship with during the weeks she'd been assembling her audit alone, back when she thought she might have to bring this case forward with no protection at all. "This is Nia Vance," she said into the phone, her voice steadying with each word as the practical work of justice gave her something solid to hold on to. "I have evidence of large-scale money laundering tied to organized crime, plus tonight's armed assault on a financial institution. I need agents at this address immediately, and I need them to take custody of a suspect who is currently secured and cooperative." Alicia, still frozen in her chair, made no move to resist, no attempt to argue or bargain, the fight finally gone out of her entirely, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. The particular relief of a person who has been drowning under the weight of their own choices for so long that even arrest feels, in some strange way, like finally being allowed to stop swimming. Do-hyun stood motionless in the center of the room, watching Nia work, watching her calm, capable hands steer the moment toward the exact kind of justice he hadn't been able to see clearly enough to choose on his own, and something in his chest, something that had been clenched tight since he was a boy watching his father bow his head to men who didn't deserve it, began, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to loosen. "I almost became him," Do-hyun said quietly, to no one in particular, though Sang-moon heard him from across the room and wheeled himself closer, resting a weathered hand against his son's arm. "You didn't," his father said. "That is the only thing that matters. You stood at the edge, Do-hyun, closer than I ever wanted you to stand. But you did not fall. And do you know why?" He glanced toward Nia, still on the phone, still steady, still holding the whole trembling room together with nothing but her own quiet courage. "Because somewhere along the way today, you finally let someone stand close enough to catch you." Federal agents arrived within 20 minutes, moving through the building with the same quiet efficiency Do-hyun's own men had shown that morning, taking Alicia into custody without incident, documenting the audit files Nia had spent weeks building in secret. Files that would, in the coming days, unravel not just one corrupt supervisor, but an entire laundering network Han Jae-woo had spent a year constructing beneath the surface of a bank nobody thought to look at closely. When the last of them had gone, when the conference room finally emptied of everyone but the three of them, Do-hyun, Nia, and Sang-moon, watching the city lights through the window in a silence that had nothing left in it but exhaustion and something quietly, tentatively, like peace. Do-hyun turned to Nia and reached for her hand the way she had reached for his an hour earlier, when everything had still hung by a single trembling thread. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried more weight than she had ever heard from him, stripped of every ounce of armor he usually wore into a room. Not for tonight, for today, for choosing to see a stranger in a wheelchair as a human being when an entire lobby full of people decided it was easier not to. For choosing, tonight, to see me as someone still worth saving. "You were always worth saving," Nia said softly, her fingers curling around his. "You just needed someone brave enough to remind you." Sang-moon watched the two of them from his wheelchair with quiet, glowing satisfaction. The kind of look a father wears when he finally sees, after decades of hardship and hard-won lessons, exactly what his son's future is going to look like, and exactly whose hand is going to be holding his the whole way there. But even as the warmth of that moment settled over the room, none of them yet knew that somewhere across the city, in a location federal agents hadn't yet traced, Han Jaiwoo had already received word that his enforcers failed and his informant had been arrested. And a man who had waited 3 years for the right moment to strike was not the kind of man who simply walked away when his first attempt fell apart in the dark. Han Jaiwoo never got the second chance he was counting on that night. Federal agents and Do Hyun's own intelligence network moved on him within the month, dismantling the last of the Silver Snake Gang's finances before he could ever regroup. And by the time the leaves changed in Seoul, his name had become nothing more than a closed case file gathering dust in an evidence room. It was, Nia would later say, the last time either of them let fear decide what happened next. 6 months had passed since the morning a bucket of dirty water had changed the course of 3 lives at once, and the bank that had once seen a wheelchair and torn clothes, and decided a man was worth nothing now stood transformed from the marble floor up. Gone were the velvet ropes that once separated wealthy clients from everyone else. Gone was the old executive floor where decisions had been made in secret, insulated from the people those decisions actually affected. In its place stood something Nia had designed herself, over long nights that stretched into early mornings, sketching out a bank built on a principle so simple it had taken an old man in a rusted wheelchair to teach an entire city that they'd forgotten it. Everyone who walked through those doors deserved to be treated like they mattered, because they did. The grand reopening filled the lobby with more people than it had ever held before: former employees, community members from neighborhoods the bank had once overlooked, journalists who had spent months following the story of the laundering scandal and the unlikely romance that had grown out of its wreckage. And Sang-moon, seated in a new wheelchair, this one gifted to him by his son, sitting proudly at the center of it all in a crisp new coat that fit him exactly the way dignity should. Nia stood at the podium in a tailored ivory suit, her natural curls pulled back the way she'd worn them the day she first knelt in front of a stranger with a towel in her hands, and looked out over a room that no longer felt like it belonged to someone else. 6 months ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the transformed lobby, an elderly man came into this building asking for nothing but the respect every human being deserves. He was denied it, and in that moment, this bank had to decide what kind of institution it actually wanted to be. She looked toward Sang-moon, and something warm passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Today, I stand here as this bank's new managing director, and I can tell you exactly what kind of institution we've decided to become. The applause that followed was not the polite, obligatory kind Nia had grown used to in boardrooms full of people who barely acknowledged her presence. This was real, sustained, filled with the particular gratitude of people who had watched someone finally build something better out of something broken. Do Hyun watched her from the side of the room, dressed in a suit that had lost none of its sharpness, but had, over the past 6 months, come to sit differently on him, the armor still there when he needed it, but no longer the only thing holding him together. Beside him stood Rays, and behind them, quietly, discreetly, a small team from what used to be the Biko Syndicate's enforcement division, now wearing the uniforms of Biko Security Solutions, a legitimate global protection firm that had, in the space of half a year, become one of the most respected names in corporate and personal security across 3 continents. Do Hyun had kept every skill his old life had forged in him, every hard-earned discipline, and simply pointed all of it toward something his father could finally be proud of without flinching. "You reformed the bank, Nia," Du-hyun said quietly, stepping up beside her once the applause settled, taking her hand in front of the entire room without a trace of hesitation. "And you saved my soul while you were doing it." "I had good material to work with," Nia said, smiling up at him. Though her eyes were bright with tears, she wasn't trying particularly hard to hide. There was one thing, though, that Du-hyun hadn't yet told her, a small secret he'd been carrying carefully for weeks now, waiting for exactly the right moment. As the crowd began to settle into a quieter hum of celebration around them, he guided her gently toward a curtained section of the newly renovated lobby, near where the old reception desk had once stood. "Before we go any further today," he said, "there's something I need to show you." He pulled back the curtain, and Nia's breath caught in her throat. A bronze plaque, freshly installed, gleamed against the marble wall, engraved not with the bank's name or its founding date, but with a single quiet sentence, dedicated to every person who has ever been judged by their appearance instead of their heart. May this building always remember what it almost forgot. Beneath it, smaller, a second inscription read, "In honor of Yoo Sang-moon, whose quiet courage 2 decades ago saved a neighborhood no one else was watching, and whose humility one ordinary Tuesday morning changed an empire." Nia pressed her hand against her mouth, tears finally spilling over as she read it a second time, then a third. "Du-hyun, this is..." "It's the truth," he said simply. "I wanted it written somewhere permanent, somewhere no one walking through these doors could ever forget it again." What none of the guests gathered in that lobby knew yet, what even Nia herself hadn't been told, was that tucked into the folder of paperwork Du-hyun had prepared for today's ceremony, waiting for a quieter, more private moment later that evening, was a second document entirely unrelated to the bank's restructuring, one that had taken him weeks of careful, nervous planning to finalize, and that would, before the night was over, change the shape of both their lives all over again. Sang-moon wheeled himself forward through the parting crowd, and as he reached the two of them standing beneath that plaque, he reached out and took each of their hands in his, weathered fingers still strong enough to hold on tight. "Welcome to our bank, father," Du-hyun said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide in front of people who mattered to him. "Where everyone is treated like royalty, exactly the way you always deserve to be." Sang-moon's eyes filled, looking between his son and the woman who had knelt in front of him on the worst morning of his recent life, and treated him like he still mattered when the rest of the world had decided otherwise. "We build this empire on respect now," he said softly, echoing words his son had spoken to him privately just days earlier. "Not fear. I never thought I would live to see it, Du-hyun, but you built it. Both of you built it together." Outside the tall glass windows of the newly reopened bank, the city moved on the way cities always do, indifferent and endless, carrying its usual mixture of small cruelties and quiet kindnesses into another ordinary day. But inside that lobby, for one bright, sunlit afternoon, an old man who had once been drenched in filth for the crime of looking poor sat surrounded by people who had rebuilt an entire institution in his honor, his son standing beside a woman whose fierce, unshakable belief in human dignity had turned a mob boss's rage into something the world had never expected from him: mercy, patience, and a legacy built on something far stronger than fear ever was. If this story reminded you why standing up for someone else, even a total stranger, is one of the most powerful things a person can do, if watching Du-hyun and Nia turn a single act of cruelty into a legacy of honor moved something in your heart, share this video right now with someone who needs the reminder that protecting the elderly, protecting dignity, protecting the people the world overlooks, is true strength. Let's make sure this story reaches every person who still believes kindness can outlast even the coldest empire. And if these chapters have left a mark on you the way I hope they have, I want to leave you with one more gift before we close this chapter for good. I've put together 2 full novels that carry that same heartbeat, one that will break you open, and one that will gently put you back together. They're waiting for you right now in the description and the pinned comment below, one simple click away. And if you're watching on your television tonight, all you have to do is lift your phone, open your camera, and scan the gold code on your screen. Let Sangmoon, Do Hyun, and Nia's story be the beginning of your next one.